Hello YouTube. The Elder Scrolls universe is filled with interesting creatures and monsters. In fact, there are so many interesting ones that I was able to make a Volume 1 and a Volume 2 compilation where I go over many different interesting creatures. If we go on like this, I'll be halfway to a decent bestiary. Now, today I'll be going over even more interesting creatures, from the ancient and extinct Verminous to the amazing and obscure Ithguleor. Now, I've covered each and every one of these creatures in the past, and I've edited all of that lore together into one long-form lore video for you to enjoy, of course with timestamps in case you want to skip a certain creature or fast forward to something that you're interested in. So, with that said, let's now start with today's first creature that we'll talk about, the Spriggan, after the intro. So, Spriggans, forest creatures often seen with tree-like, almost human-like bodies, often with a body that resembles a humanoid female, although they can take on many more different shapes. Now, in essence, Spriggans are nature spirits and are often regarded as nature's guardians by the people of Tamriel. They appear to be completely made out of wood, but they can sometimes be covered in foliage, like leaves and branches as well, and they may also emit light from their bodies. In addition to that, some Spriggans have bugs and insects inhabiting their bodies, like bees and hornets, which they can also use in combat. Their main behavior pattern is that they protect the places of nature where they live, but they are observed to be calm and gentle with most natural creatures that live in the woods, really only being aggressive against travelers who wish harm upon nature and the places that they try to protect. Their relationship with the creatures of the forest is generally very friendly, and forest creatures like bears, foxes and insects will often aid the Spriggans in battle. But it's suggested that this may not be fully out of love for the Spriggans, but rather that the Spriggans may control these forest creatures with their own magic, forcing them to fight along with them. As we have instances where weak Spriggans are fighting with trolls, for example, while stronger Spriggans are defended by trolls, suggesting that they simply control these creatures, as if the Spriggan is stronger, they're able to dominate the troll, while weaker Spriggans can only dominate stuff like foxes. In battle, Spriggans tend to use their long fingers as blades, and they may take a bite with their sharp teeth out of their enemies. They also have the ability to poison living creatures, and they have strong healing powers that make them difficult enemies to put down for good, as their healing powers almost give them a second wind when they were just about to be killed. Now, the color of their bodies is actually different for different Spriggans, with some thinking that the change in color has to do with the environment that they live in and their adaptation to the environment. For example, in Morrowind's Snowy Souls time, we saw very light green, almost white Spriggans. In Skyrim's Green Glades, we see green ones. In volcanic regions, we see red burnt Spriggans. While some people speculate that this may have to do with the seasons, it seems to more have to do with their adaptation to the local environment that they are in. Now, how exactly the Spriggans came into being is as of yet unknown, but a general trend is that most cultures seem to believe that they were created by the gods or goddesses of nature. So it's believed by the Norse of Skyrim, for example, that Spriggans are the creation of the goddess Kine or Kinnereth, while the Bosmers, or the Wood Elves, and the Breton Druids, who think that the god Ifra is the god of nature, believe that nature spirits like Spriggans were all created by him. Meanwhile, according to the legends of the Nordic Skal tribe on Solstheim, Spriggans supposedly came into being when the Allmaker, the mysterious deity that the Skal primarily worship, blew his breath through the lands and trees, creating Spriggans as their guardians. What's interesting here is that the player base often just calls Spriggans forest Atronachs or wood Atronachs due to them looking kinda like forest flame Atronachs, but that's almost certainly not the case. You see, while flame Atronachs and frost Atronachs, for example, are Daedric creatures, which you have to summon from Oblivion, Spriggans seem to be forest spirits, explicitly native to Tamriel, and may even be Aedric creatures if you believe the theories about their creation, which is pretty cool. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Spriggans have some variants and different forms that they can take on. For example, as mentioned earlier, they can appear with several different color schemes, with the regular green Spriggan being the most common, but brown, orange and almost white super mint green and purple bluish variants also existing, with even wilder variants created through corruption. But apart from color differences, the Spriggan can actually come in quite a few different shapes and subspecies, with one of these variants being the Lurcher. Lurchers are made by corrupting a Spriggan with dark magic, which makes them even more powerful and makes them larger, which is why some call them the polluted cousins of Spriggans. Once a Spriggan has assumed the form of a Lurcher, it's said that the nature spirit within is actually corrupted and tortured, and that their spirit remains tortured until they are put down and killed. What's interesting here is that that's apparently not the only way to create a Lurcher, as while most methods known of creating Lurchers involve some form of dark magic, the forest-loving Bosmer actually create them to protect the forest, but it's suggested that they create Lurchers apparently not from Spriggans, but that they grow the husks of Lurchers themselves and then imbue them with power. Which is pretty interesting, but a topic for a different video, as Lurchers probably deserve their own video at some point. On that point, we also have the Gnarl, a Spriggan-like creature which may have been created in imitation of the Spriggans, or maybe a Daedric prince's corruption of the Spriggan, which also deserves their own video, or at least belong in an interesting Creatures of the Plains of Oblivion video. But to get back on topic, another trio of variants are the Burnt Spriggan found on Solstheim after the eruption of the Red Mountain in the 4th era and on volcanic regions around Tamriel, and the Spriggan Matron and the Spriggan Earth Mother. Burnt Spriggans are a flaming variant of Spriggan that use destructive flame spells instead of nature magic. They can be found in volcanic regions, and they have a far worse temperament compared to their woodland kin, and when they are close to death they explode with fire. And even though this seems like a regular Spriggan that just got burnt, it seems that this is actually an adaptation variant of the Spriggan, so a variant that adapted to its environment, and not really, a regular Spriggan that somehow got burned, which is pretty interesting. Now, something else that's pretty interesting is that Spriggan Earth Mothers are a more powerful version of the regular Spriggans. They often have a purple coloring and are far better at controlling nature when compared to their lesser kin, with them being able to control very powerful creatures. Spriggan Matrons seem to be a variant more powerful than regular Spriggans, but lesser than the Earth Mothers. The Matrons often have an orange coloring in contrast to the regular green Spriggan and the Earth Mothers that have a purple coloring. What's interesting here is that these titles, like Matron, suggest a hierarchy among Spriggans, and in some cases we can even see a group of Spriggans being led by a Matron or an Earth Mother, which is pretty cool, and suggests a more complex way of life than we actually know about. Now, other than morphing into more powerful variants, Spriggans are also capable of morphing into more animalistic shapes, such as bears and large cats, and on the island of Galen we can find colossal Spriggans. Now, it's unknown if these giant variants of Spriggans are actually native to these islands, or that they can be found in other places, but on Galen there's actually one Spriggan, a really large powerful blue Spriggan, that can give us a clue. That Spriggan is called the Preserver of Galen, and it's said that the Preserver, which is seemingly an ancient colossal Spriggan that wanders the island and seeks to drive out all non-druids from the land, was summoned to protect this land. Its lore states that it was once summoned by the druids, who over the ages forgot how to control it, which is actually quite interesting, and it may mean that the other colossal Spriggans of the island may have also been summoned, or may be offspring of those who were summoned, or may all be offspring of the Preserver of Galen. But unfortunately we just don't know anything more than that. Now, talking about offspring though, several interactions in the games reveal that Spriggans actually procreate through seeds, and that from a seed can grow a new Spriggan. Now, we don't know their reproductive methods, so how they create those seeds, at all. All we know is that they come from seeds, and my personal speculation is that it's likely that the Earth Mothers create the seeds, since, that's why they're probably called Earth Mothers, since they put seeds in the earth. But since Spriggans are spirits and can take on whatever shape that they want to take on, I presume that their reproduction is asexual, especially as there's a side quest in the Elder Scrolls Online which suggests that one Spriggan is enough to repopulate an entire area with them, suggesting that you don't need multiple Spriggans for reproduction, as one Spriggan can seemingly produce the necessary seeds in time. Now, as I said earlier, Spriggans are regarded as nature's guardians, but despite being revered by some people on Tamriel for protecting nature, they often live in secluded places, often beautiful places which they tend to protect against harm, and also protect against those who even revere the Spriggans. They more often than not attack travelers, possibly because of any encroachment on their territory, and because that encroachment is then seen as an attack on nature itself by these creatures, and they rarely tolerate people inside their glades. Now, considering that there's a well-known joke, popular among children of Tamriel, that goes, "Guess what? Spriggan butt." I have no idea what the context of the joke is, but it's a joke that's apparently popular with children on Tamriel. I personally speculate that children at the very least do not fear these woodland spirits to any great extent, since there are no jokes about, for example, werewolf butts to my knowledge, meaning that perhaps in children's stories, the Spriggan isn't really presented as a big threat, but rather as a good-natured protector of nature. While adults generally tend to fear the Spriggans to a greater degree, especially travelers traveling through the woods. Alchemists, on the other hand, value Spriggans. Or, more correctly, they rather value the ingredients that Spriggan bodies provide, as they provide quite a lot of useful ingredients for potions, like primarily taproot, but also belladonna berries, heartwood, Spriggan sap, primal sproutling and more. In other words, a treasure trove for many alchemists. And once a year, Spriggans tend to shed their branches and their leaves, which are called the Spriggan's veil when shed, and these are valued by mages and herbalists alike because they are thought to be useful in druid practices and to have a symbolic meaning. And there's even a witches circle, the Glenmariel Weird, that are believed to use Spriggan sap in their tattoo ink, in hope that the one who has the tattoos may find a deeper bond with nature through nature's protectors. Now, on a final note, Spriggans actually have a language that's unique to them, although in Daggerfall we see that this language can be learned and can be used to calm Spriggans. And some scholars believe that Spriggans actually cannot behave in an intelligent manner and that they are creatures who act purely on instinct, attacking travelers and the people of Tamriel indiscriminately. But that's decidedly not true, as we know that not only can Spriggans learn and speak Tamrielic, as we have several examples in the games, they can even negotiate and reason. One time that this happens is in the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, where you can speak to one of them. In that game you can find a Spriggan that can tell you that it killed people in the woods who had destroyed her seedlings. It then asks what the player would do if someone killed his seedlings, and then tells the player that it wishes no ill will upon the player, and that if the woodsman who destroyed their seedlings handle the woods with more care in the future, she could let them live in peace. This shows that not only do they try to protect nature, but even more importantly, this interaction also shows that Spriggans have a certain level of intelligence, the capability of reason, emotion and negotiation. So based on that, it would be hard to argue that they are stupid and act only on instinct, as they are clearly more intelligent than that. And that is about all I can say about Tamriel's Spriggans. Now, next up, let's talk about one of Tamriel's most legendary and mysterious creatures, at least to those outside of Blackmarsh. The swamp dragons of Tamriel, or the Wamasu. So, the Wamasu. By many outside of Blackmarsh they are called swamp dragons, mainly because of their appearance, at least those of their skulls, because they're very similar to the ancient legends and etchings that the people of Tamriel had about the dragons before their return. But just to be very clear, the Wamasu is not related to the dragon. Dragons are semi-divine, immortal and ageless beings tied to the world, while the Wamasu is just a regular creature. I mean, a very awesome creature, but definitely not on the power or metaphysical level of a dragon. That having been said, the Wamasu does have quite an interesting story. First of all, its name Wamasu is actually a word in the Argonian language Gel, which means the big-mouthed reptile of blood lightning. Quite a mouthful, so for now I will keep using the gel name Wamasu. Now, the fact that the word lightning is in their fully translated name is not a coincidence, as these creatures have an innate connection to electricity. In fact, in their original lore introduction to the Elder Scrolls universe in Morrowind, they were described as a powerful dragon-like creature with innate magical electrical powers, whose bones and fangs, when crafted into weapons, possessed innate shock enchantments. You can see this clearly in their final design, where they use electrical attacks, and several variants also seem to have permanent lightning coursing through their veins of their bodies, which partly seem to resemble dragons, partly resemble crocodiles and partly resemble fish. With their large bodies and innate magical powers, they are by far one of the most dangerous creatures that someone could encounter in Blackmarsh's swamps. Regular Argonians fear them and fear to be eaten by them, and around the swamp phrases like strong as a Wamasu are common, as Wamasu have become this kind of icon or representation of strength and power in the marshes. You see, in the lore they are supposed to not only be super strong, but they're also supposed to be really agile, as another saying is that one cannot outrun the Wamasu. And their features don't end here, as they can also swim underwater and stay submerged for longer times as they have gills. Meaning that if you get to a deeper part of the marshes, they may just dive down and then take you by surprise. But that's not the only reason that it's a bad idea to fight a Wamasu in the water, as they will make the water around you convulse and go wild during combat, making it even harder to take down the Wamasu. You see, in their original lore in Morrowind, a group of Nords who traveled to Black Marsh took on a Wamasu, and it's said in the legend that it took them a good 7 days to take one down. And while Argonian hunting parties do hunt Wamasu, and they may also make weapons and clothing out of Wamasu parts if they manage to kill one, it's considered quite the accomplishment if you can take one down, to give you an idea of the strength and endurance of the Wamasu in lore. Now, even in-game they are nothing to scoff at, as in the Elder Scrolls Online they can be quite difficult for new players, and some of the Wamasus in dungeons can actually be quite fearsome bosses, even for experienced players. Plus, story-wise, one Wamasu is seemingly enough to bring down an entire ship, or collapse an entire underground sewer. They attack with their massive bodies, and their innate strength and innate electricity, with the Wamasu's body in combat apparently getting so hot that they may start to emit steam, which is pretty cool and pretty brutal. Now, something interesting here is that these creatures outside of Black Marsh are obscure but not really uncommon, because there's a sizable population of Wamasus in eastern Morrowind and a smaller pocket of them in eastern Hammerfell, although it's likely that those came about due to people taking Wamasu eggs and young Wamasu somewhere to Hammerfell and then letting them go into nature, or perhaps they escaped. Because it's quite likely that Western Morrowind's population probably came about due to natural migration, but it's pretty unlikely that they came there by themselves naturally, so far away in Hammerfell. That having been said, that's all speculation, so take it with a grain of salt, because we literally know nothing about the real migration patterns of these creatures to the different areas, but I just think it's more logical that Morrowind probably has a natural migration. Meanwhile to Hammerfell, it seems quite likely to me that they got there due to people taking young Wamasu and Wamasu eggs there. Because there's definitely quite a few examples of Wamasu being taken out of the swamps by the people of Tamriel and transporting them somewhere else. You see, while your average Tamrielic citizen may not be aware of the Wamasu's existence, as many regular people outside of Black Marsh doubt whether a creature which is dubbed a swamp dragon can even exist, pirates and other shady types around Tamriel absolutely know about the Wamasu, as it's a favorite guard animal to have chained up and guard your valuables or important places for shady people. We have several such examples throughout Tamriel, and there's even evidence that the Second Era Pirate Queen Fortunata Abdugul, who I coincidentally already did a video on, link in the description, that she actively traded in Wamasu to people who wanted one as a guard animal or as a war beast. Pretty shady stuff. That being said, young Wamasu can be tamed, although some sources suggest that once they grow up and become too powerful, they become very hard to control. For example, there's one quite amusing story of a Wamasu which was put in chains by pirates with the intention of selling it to a buyer, absolutely ripping their entire ship to shreds, which is why the pirates that try to move Wamasus often have them drugged before their transport, so that they are a bit more docile and your ship doesn't go down with the Wamasu. That being said, in the Wamasu trade it seems that Wamasu matrons, big female Wamasu that can lay eggs for reproduction, are by far the most valuable, as they will be able to lay the eggs that new tameable young Wamasu will hatch from. Funnily enough, we actually have a pretty detailed account of Wamasu reproduction, which is pretty funny as we rarely get such a deep insight. It seems that just like with many creatures in our real world, Wamasu are able to lay both fertilized and unfertilized eggs. Eggs that are fertilized by a male Wamasu will hatch a baby Wamasu, while non-fertilized eggs will not produce baby Wamasu. Instead, just like many unfertilized eggs in our own world, you can eat them. Wamasu eggs are considered a bit of a delicacy, especially in Black Marsh, and we have quite a few examples of Argonians selling Wamasu eggs for consumption, although we don't know what they taste like. That being said, our information about the reproductive cycle actually goes a little bit further than that, because as you can see, Wamasu produce large blue glowing eggs that pulse with electricity. The electric pulsating actually indicates the stage in the hatchling's cycle, as pulsating eggs are fertilized, and when they stop pulsating electricity, you know that they are close to hatching. Now, when they hatch, the mother will care for the young Wamasu, as the male Wamasu that fertilized them is suggested to actually eat its own offspring if it gets the chance, which is also something that we see with some animal species in our real life. Now, if as a daredevil or shady pirate you are able to steal away some of these young Wamasu in order to tame them, make sure that you have a steady food supply for them, as Wamasu eat almost every living creature, including you, because we know for example that in the swamps and in Morrowind they will eat the playable races, but they will also eat creatures like mudcrabs and Kaguti and prefer eating their prey alive. We even have a lore source which describes how to feed a Wamasu, and essentially the gist of it is, feed it living creatures because otherwise it will try to eat you, and be sure to have enough variation in its daily meals, because otherwise the Wamasu may get cranky and eat you again, because, you know, it already had a mud crab yesterday. Overfeeding is also a very bad idea, as apparently it will then produce dangerous amounts of discharge. Basically, keep the Wamasu happy and you may live. Now, in terms of variants, they come in several different color schemes: purple, brown and green. And you even have a red, yellowish version which has innate fire abilities instead of lightning abilities, which it said that it came about after Wamasu eggs were hatched in the Deadlands, the plane of oblivion of Mehrunes Dagon with all the lava, the Daedric prince of chaos and destruction. Now, a final interesting note about the Wamasu is that their legendary strength has made it so that they are a favorite for magical experiments. The Wamasu's essence has been used in the magical creation of manticoras, and the Wamasu was likely also involved somehow in the creation of chimeras, as one of its head is literally a Wamasu, which is pretty cool. Alright, and that's about all I can say about the Wamasu. Next up, let's talk about a creature that's also very fearsome in combat, the Ogre. So, Ogres. Ogres are large primitive creatures that live in Tamriel's caves and hills and deep forests, primarily in Cyrodiil, but there are population pockets in other provinces as well. They are large, and at least by the people of Tamriel considered to be pretty dumb, with an intelligence significantly lower than that of the playable mortal races. Now, this large and strong physique in combination with their bad temper has actually led them to become a bit of a boogeyman in stories and songs, with them often being portrayed as very dangerous. And with good reason, because they are far stronger and bigger than your average mortal, although they tend to be a little weaker than giants from what we can tell. Now, they primarily live high up in Cyrodiil's hills, in the deepest parts of some forests and in its caves out in the wilds, but also often close enough to settlements in order to raid them for food and supplies, and with food there I mean humans, elves, Argonians and Khajiit, as often ogres will eat the playable races. But we know that they also hunt for and eat wild animals. I mean, they essentially see humans, elves, Argonians and Khajiit as just another animal to eat. And we even know that their bodies can also process plant-based food, which is pretty interesting. But I felt like mentioning the fact that they eat the playable races of Tamriel during raids is actually something that I should mention and highlight. Now, this raiding of villages and settlements is actually quite similar to what goblins do, and that behavior is not where their similarities to the goblins end. In fact, in terms of looks, they mostly look like big, oversized goblins with bluish or greenish skin and long pointed ears. In fact, a lot of scholars on Tamriel seem to think that they are actually related to the goblins, dubbing them a kind of goblin kin. And we have many examples of goblins and ogres teaming up and even forming mixed tribal societies, where often the ogres, seeing as they are stronger than the goblins, take up leadership positions, with there often being an ogre chieftain and other leaders with many goblins following their leadership. Now, this actually points to a quite interesting little side note, as we don't know whether or not ogres have a language of their own, but what we do know is that goblins have their own language, and with ogres taking a leading role in their society, I would assume that this means that ogres can also speak the goblin language, and considering that goblins can actually learn the common Tamrielic language, at least somewhat, it could mean that ogres are also able to speak Tamrielic, so the regular common language, as they seem to mostly be on a similar level of intelligence to goblins. And we even have some evidence that at least some of them are able to read, but the whole speaking part was speculation, as we have no examples of ogres ever speaking a language in any of the games, except for using some grunts, which may actually have just been a deeper voiced version of the goblin language, as heard by someone who does not know the goblin language. But again, that's speculation. Now, what's not speculation is that they don't always live together with goblins. In fact, it's far more common to come across a regular tribe of ogres, which is only comprised of ogres and is led by a chieftain, and often having some sort of shaman with them as well, who actually seem to have access to the same kinds of magic that goblin shamans have access to. And it sometimes seems even more powerful magic, or at least a little bit more powerful magic than the goblins. Now, these shamans seem to also be the ones handling the religion and religious worship in their groups, as we know that ogres, just like the goblins, worship a version of either Malakath or the orcish god Maulog, who they know as Muluk, with it most likely being Malakath, as Malakath actively concerns himself with the fate of the ogres, calling them his little brothers. And some cultures, like the Reachmen, believe that ogres were actually created by Malakath alongside the trolls and the orcs. So that also points towards their deity Muluk being some kind of version of Malakath. Now, these ogre-only tribes tend to be a bit smaller than the large ogre-led goblin tribes, often only consisting of a handful of ogres and sometimes some domesticated animals like bears, because yes, the ogres are strong enough to keep bears under control and domesticate them, which is actually pretty cool. Now, these smaller ogre tribes seem to live a kind of nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, living in places relatively close to settlements of the mortal races of Tamriel to raid them, only to then likely find a new place once they destroyed or completely exhausted the settlement. From what we can tell, ogre tribes don't seem to carry much stuff around when they have to move. As far as we can tell, tribes that only comprise of ogres don't tend to make buildings or tents, and very few of that which they do have seems to be taken with them. As while some ogres use weapons and wear primitive armor, most of their other things that they possess and make seems designed to be left behind. Like for example, they tend to have some fun with the bones of the ones they eat and make decorative piles of bones for their lairs, which I don't imagine they take with them when they move to the next spot. But that isn't the only type of fun that ogres can have with the bones of those they just ate, as they are also known to turn human bones into musical instruments, which sounds like jolly fun. Now, that being said, there seems to be several different types of ogres. In fact, in different areas of Tamriel, there are different types of ogres. In Cyrodiil you can find the regular grey-greenish ogre, while in Northern High Rock you can find the bluish-skinned snow ogres, who are also said to be a little bit more intelligent than their green cousins from the south, while also mastering more advanced magic. Now, the history of the ogres is actually quite vague and obscure. While we have several incidents in history where ogres played a part from the Meretic era all the way to the 4th era, there aren't that many things that can be said about them as a race altogether, other than that they have long since inhabited Tamriel and that they may have been there since before even the Elves landed on Tamriel, just like the goblins. While some others believe that they were created at the same time as the orcs and the trolls by the Daedric prince Malakath. However, that would mean that they may not be related to the goblins after all, if that theory is true. Whatever the case is, my personal speculation is that they are likely an evolved version of the goblin and have evolved away from them over the millennia after having a common ancestor race during the Dawn era, likely starting as one of the original inhabitants of Tamriel, because we even have an ancient Khajiit legend involving ogres that actually takes place long before the orcs were created, so that seems a little bit more logical to me, but it's my personal speculation, so the other theories may still be true. Now, that being said, both theories are equally valid, as ogres over the course of Tamriel's history have both been known to cooperate and interact with the orcs and cooperate and interact with the goblins. Now, of course, I already talked about their cooperation with the goblins, but we also know that they are known to cooperate with the orcs every now and then, although that cooperation is rarer than with the goblins. Because, you see, one of the earliest things that we know about ogre history is that they, along with the goblins and some of the first orcs, were enslaved by the High Elves in the First Era, being used for manual labor and other tasks that the High Elves themselves did not want to do. Now, somewhere during the First Era, something happened that led the High Elves to set many of their former slaves free. An exact reason for this isn't given, but we do know that thousands of orcs and ogres, along with goblins and gremlins apparently, were set free, and that they trekked northwards across Tamriel to found the very first Orsinium on the border between High Rock and Skyrim. And despite Orsinium translating to Orc Town, ogres actually helped build it, and it seemed that the ogres would actively take part in Orsinium's society for a large part of its history. However, it does seem that the cooperation between the orcs and the ogres eventually ended, perhaps when the first Orsinium was destroyed by the Redguard and Breton armies, as in the second Orsinium that we see in the Second Era during the Elder Scrolls Online, there are no ogres living in the city premises. However, that does not mean that their ogre interaction with the orcs stopped. In fact, in Northern High Rock, where the first Orsinium used to be and close to the second Orsinium, several ogre tribes continued to interact with the orcs, sometimes being at war with them and sometimes still cooperating and allying with them over the years. Now, over the course of Tamriel's long history, ogres would remain a bit of a pariah. While they would work with the goblins and sometimes tribes would ally with the orcs, they mostly kept to themselves, and being a bit of a nuisance to the people of Tamriel, raiding and stealing, killing people, taking over caves and mines, that kind of thing. Now, something funny is that in the Elder Scrolls Castles, a game whose canonicity is highly doubtful as it contains characters who never lived in the same time period, and does many other things that can contradict the canon, or at least don't seem to be marryable to the canon, that game actually mentions a 3rd era ogre king who even amassed an army of ogres and was defeated by the original king of your keep in the Elder Scrolls castles, which, I mean, that's cool, but I don't really know if it's canon. But, you know, I still feel like I, needed to mention it. It's an ogre king. It's pretty cool. Now, that having been said, that's about all I can say about Tamriel's ogres. Next up, let's talk about another fearsome creature that we primarily find in Cyrodiil, the Minotaurs. So, Minotaurs, strange amalgamations between a human and a bull. They primarily live in the heartlands of Tamriel, being Cyrodiil and its border regions, where they can be one of the most fearsome enemies that you can encounter in the game. By the people of Tamriel, they are seen as dangerous brutes who are to be avoided at all costs, often making it into children's stories as the boogeyman for the hero of the story to overcome or slay. They are creatures of immense strength, with the average Minotaur being able to easily lift up and throw several fully armed soldiers, making them deadly in battle. In addition, they are excellent trackers. If you manage to wrong a Minotaur, they are able to follow you for miles by just following your tracks and your scent. By many, Minotaurs are seen as a symbol of ultimate strength, and anyone who manages to defeat one has accomplished an amazing feat of strength and combat prowess. In fact, on modern day Tamriel, so that is in the 3rd and the 4th era, Minotaurs are often captured and thrown into arenas to serve as the ultimate challenge for a gladiator. Now, despite this fearsome reputation, Minotaurs themselves actually tend to be quite passive and mind their own business. As long as a mortal does not come into their territory and does not do any harm to their clan, they will generally keep out of the way of the people of Tamriel, just like the people try to keep out of the way of the Minotaurs. And that is why there is not much that the people of Tamriel actually know about the Minotaurs, as they are, or at least definitely used to be, a lot more advanced than the cave trolls that the people of Tamriel often compare the Minotaurs to. For starters, Minotaurs often live in clans of several dozen other Minotaurs, often led by a lord or a chieftain. Within these clans, only the lord or chieftain is allowed to have children, just like with the tribal orcs. And just like with the tribal orcs, other Minotaurs will often challenge the leader in a duel to the death to see if they can become the next chief and have the breeding rights. But that's not all, because they also have their own language, although it's not a language that most mortals are able to understand, except for some specialists. They also have their own obscure religion. We don't know anything about that religion other than that it's there, but hey, we know it's there. And they are even able to make their own clothes and weaponry, or at least they used to be. And I say used to because, unbeknownst to many, they actually have a quite tragic backstory. You see, Minotaurs in the Elder Scrolls universe are, or at least used to be, an intelligent beast race, just like Khajiit and Argonians, who long ago used to be a pretty prominent part of the Cyrodiilic society, and are said to have been as intelligent as the other mortal races. They used to live alongside the other races and even played a pivotal part in the creation of the very first Cyrodiilic Empire. This strange regression in their culture from being a prominent part of society in the first era to having a near animal status in the third era is really striking to see. In fact, we can witness it ourselves, as in the Elder Scrolls Online in the second era, we kinda see the halfway point in between the sophisticated Minotaurs of the first era and the wild Minotaurs of the third and the fourth era. Because in the second era we see them being way more organized, and they wear more clothing, they use more advanced weaponry, and they're even able to organize themselves into a small army, at least one clan, and attack the city of Falkreath together with some reachmen. Meanwhile, 800 years later, in the third era, they have regressed even further to the point where they are literally treated as and behave like beasts a lot of the time, even wearing less and less advanced clothing than before. Now, to at least partially understand where this strange regression came from, we need to go back to the first era, to the time of the founding of the first Cyrodiilic Empire, the Alessian Empire. You see, in the Meretic era, which was the era of Tamriel's history in which dates and time weren't really properly kept yet, the humans and beast races of Cyrodiil were by and large enslaved by the Ayleid Elves, who then dominated the Heartlands. For more information about that, watch yesterday's video on the Ayleid Empire. Now, of course, the humans and beast races did not particularly enjoy being enslaved, and so eventually, in the early First Era, they rose up against their enslavers under the leadership of Alessia the Slave Queen. Now, Alessia the Slave Queen did not organize and execute this rebellion all by herself. No. She was helped by the legendary hero Pelinal Whitestrake and the demigod Morehos the Man-Bull, a half-divine Minotaur who, in many sources it is claimed, was the first Minotaur of Tamriel, and that all the Minotaurs trace their lineage back to him and Slave Queen Alessia. Because in the ancient stories, it is said that after the rebellion was won and a human Cyrodiilic empire, the Alessian Empire, was proclaimed with Alessia as its first empress, Alessia and Morihos allegedly mated and had a son, Belharza the Man-Bull, who in the stories was the actual first Minotaur, as Morihos, despite looking like one, was actually a half-divine being. I mean, you can see he's basically a Minotaur with wings. Now, if you're still with me, the traditional story goes that with their union and the birth of their child Belharza, Morihos used his near-divine powers to create more Minotaurs in the image of their son and with his and Alessia's blood, starting the Minotaur race proper, meaning that all Minotaurs that we see, according to this legend, are descended from Alessia and Morihos. Now, what exactly the truth of this legend is, we don't know. We do know that their son Belharza existed and that he was a Minotaur, and that he was the only known Minotaur emperor of the empire. And the historical records of his reign still exist, so we know he existed and we know that he was an emperor. I even made a video on him, which is in the description if you want to know more about the Minotaur emperor of Cyrodiil. But the whole legend of Minotaurs all being descended from Alessia and Morihos, I don't know. As there are also Tamrielic historians who claim that there's evidence of Minotaurs having existed prior to the Alessian slave rebellion, and that they were also enslaved together with the humans and other beast races, and that they joined the rebellion once it started. While yet others say that the Minotaurs were not a natural beast race, but that the Minotaurs are the result of alien experiments on humans and bulls. What the truth is, we don't know, as this all takes place more than 3000 years before the events of Oblivion and Skyrim, so I doubt we will ever really know the truth. But what we do know is that early during the Alessian Empire, the Minotaur was a much celebrated symbol of the empire, being on flags and statues. The Minotaurs were actually part of the Alessian people, and they served as really strong soldiers in the Alessian Empire's early army. They were, for all terms and purposes, a fully fledged beast race like the Argonians and the Khajiit, and intermingled with the peoples of Tamriel just as the Argonians and Khajiit do nowadays. I mean, I've seen comments about people seeing the whole Alessia and Morihos romance as a really strange thing and out of character, but remember that this is the same universe where humans and elves sometimes marry Argonians and Khajiit, so just something to keep in mind considering the Minotaurs at the time had a similar status to them. Now, that having been said, what led to the downfall of the Minotaurs from being part of an emerging empire to the near beasts that we see today? Well, humans are the reason, kind of. You see, at some point after the reign of Emperor Belharza, an extremist faction called the Alessian Order practically took over the rule of the empire, with the Emperor of the Alessian Empire essentially just being their puppet. This group instigated many reforms in the empire, cultural reforms, religious reforms and population reforms. Because first they essentially banned and killed the remaining aliens in the empire who had originally chosen the side of the humans in the slave rebellion and now lived in human-dominated empire territory. And after that, they decided to also banish Minotaurs from their society, as the Alessian Order created laws that reclassified Minotaurs as monsters, just like trolls, outlawing their participation in society and driving them out of the cities and into the forests and the hills, destroying their culture and destroying all the records of their accomplishments as much as they could, even if some evidence of their once proud culture did survive, which is why we know all of this. This decree made it so that the Minotaurs were no longer welcome in society and were not able to participate or trade with the Empire, forcing them into a tribal lifestyle in the wilds, while the Alessian Order hunted down those who remained. It is theorized that the Alessian Order did this because they did not trust the Minotaurs and saw their immense strength, considering it a threat to their own power. Because the Minotaurs had been fiercely loyal to Alessia and her descendant emperors, so they likely feared that if the Minotaurs saw that the emperor was just a figurehead for the Alessian Order, the Minotaurs may rebel against the empire. So they just, fired the first shot before the Minotaurs could do anything. Now, once driven into the wilds and isolated, Minotaur cultures started to regress. They became tribal and more wild, until the point where the people of Tamriel saw them as mere beasts to be feared rather than people to live alongside of. And even now it's said that the Minotaurs primarily settle in those regions of great significance to the ancient Alessian Empire, as if driven by some primal instinct or feeling that it's those places that they need to guard. And that is about all I can say about the Minotaurs. Now, next up, let's talk about a creature that many of us have probably faced at some point in the past while playing through Skyrim, the Draugr. There's a surprisingly large backstory to them. So, the Draugr, undead creatures roaming the ancient tombs of Skyrim, one of the game's most recognizable enemies. In the lore they are described as skeletons raised and wrapped around transparent flesh, rags of leather half rotted away, and helms from another age, many horned and all of fine craftsmanship, adorning some of the tougher, heavily armored Draugr. Pale blue, lifeless eyes bathed in eerie mist, hovering in black sockets. Pretty creepy. But these undead are not just zombies, rather they are followers of an ancient cult given eternal life, although it's an eternal life of servitude and without free will. Let me explain. Several thousands of years before the events of Skyrim, before the First Era even began, the ancestors of the modern-day Nords worshipped the dragons as gods in what was known as the Dragon Cult. I talked about that in depth in a different video and about their beliefs, which I'll put in the description in case you want to check out their beliefs. But in short, these humans believe that the dragons deserve to rule over humanity like gods, deserving the humans' eternal worship in return for several boons and, in some cases, eternal life. Now, the dragons themselves weren't really too interested in the details of ruling the masses. They enjoyed the symbolism of being humanity's god rulers, but they didn't want to concern themselves too much with details. So they appointed certain mortal humans as their representatives to humanity, forming a special bond with these individuals who would don masks and then speak with the dragon's authority and rule on their behalf. These individuals were the dragon priests, who in some cases had more power than kings among the early Nordic society. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Dragon Cult back in the day had access to some pretty advanced magical necromantic rituals, which were the techniques used to create the Draugr and preserve the dragon priests up until the modern day. You see, you can't really talk about the Draugr without talking about the dragon priests, as while there are two different types of undead, with the dragon priest being a type of lich created from ancient Nordic necromancy, they're explicitly linked with the Draugr. You see, the eternal life promised to some of the followers of the Dragon Cult came at a price for most regular cultists, specifically the seeming loss of free will and eternal servitude, work and worship in service to the Dragon Priest. Now, these Dragon Priests, they got a significantly better deal, as they got turned into undead liches, and they seem to have retained some form of free will, even though it's suggested that they may also be chained to Alduin's will in some way, but that's a topic for another day. The important thing to understand is that back in the day, these dragon priests, when they were in power, had elaborate tombs built for themselves for the time in which they would be turned into a lich to gain eternal life. They would be buried in these tombs alongside their followers, who would be turned into the Draugr and who would lose their free will and be forced to rise from the dead. Now, when they were risen from the dead, or some form of eternal magical sleep, they worshipped the dragon priest, they cleaned the tombs and protect the tombs from intruders, and also transfer life energy to the dragon priest. You see, we have several lore books mentioning how the Draugr go to the dragon priest's coffin to worship the coffin, and the priest within, with an energy transfer taking place from the Draugr to the priest. An important note here is that apparently in almost every tomb in the lore there is some form of dragon priest interred. I know that especially at earlier levels there are some higher level Draugr in like the final coffin of a dungeon, but in the lore there are apparently all forms of dragon priests, at least most of them. Now, this worship and this energy transfer that happens from the Draugr to the person in the coffin happens in some sort of shifts, with different sets of Draugr waking up every day from this magical sleep-like death to transfer energy to the dragon priest, and then also clean the tomb and worship the coffin. Why exactly they do this, we don't really know. I imagine that the dragon priest requires it somehow to sustain its lich form of eternal life, but we don't know exactly what's going on with this energy transfer. Interestingly enough, despite them being trapped in an eternal servitude to their priest, the Draugr seem to have retained some intelligence, not much, but definitely more intelligence than your average zombie, because despite in-universe scholars describing Draugr as having only the barest whisper of life, the Draugr are still able to speak in the dragon language, and they seem to have some sort of mental hive mind intelligence that allows them to coordinate themselves in groups around the tomb, and it's likely that the dragon priest in its coffin is somehow at the center of this sort of hive mind they seem to have, although we don't have any concrete lore on how this works exactly, nor the word hive mind. I just found that to be the most accurate word to describe what we have. We just know that they are able to coordinate thoughts between them somehow and alter behaviors as groups, in combination with the fact that they have some sort of mystical connection to their dragon priest. So the word hive mind seemed the most logical explanation. Now, most modern-day Tamrielic scholars seem to speculate that the eternal servitude and loss of free will seem to be some sort of punishment from the Age of the Dragons. But that doesn't really seem to be the case, because from some surviving dragon cult sources we learn that, at least in their theology and propaganda, it said that the dragon priest's most dedicated followers freely gave their eternal service as a sacrifice to their faith, and by the most dedicated worshippers, having yourself be turned into a Draugr was apparently seen as the purest form of worship, as it's an eternal, unbreakable life promise to your faith. They also cannot stray too far from their tombs, it seems, as it seems that their servitude somehow binds them to their tombs and to their priests. Now, something really interesting here is that we have some sources saying that the Draugr, before being buried in the tombs alongside their masters, went through a partial mummification process, with many of their internal organs being removed before being put in the tombs for servitude, as to preserve their bodies for a longer time and to prevent internal rot, which would make them less effective long-term servants, and which is why we see most of them still having skin, despite having been buried millennia ago. We even have an in-universe scholar speculating that when they were buried, the Draugr looked just like regular humans, just with an eerie blue glow in their eyes and no free will, and that it took thousands of years of degradation for them to become the way that they are now. An interesting bit of speculation here is that this may have even meant that back when the dragon cult was active and alive and the priests still ruled, some dragon priests may have ruled the cults from their tombs, where they already had their servants already made into Draugr, but just looking like regular humans, which then served them in their lich bodies already while they were still ruling, while living humans were also still visiting their tombs, or rather palace-like tombs, in the days of the dragon cult, making for some pretty creepy government buildings. I mean, imagine going to petition the local dragon priest for some new goats or whatever because your neighbor stole them, and just having to go through this palace-like tomb where people who look like regular humans but without free will and an eerie blue glow in their eyes and locked into some hive mind were also just walking around and cleaning the place and transferring energy to the dragon priest. Not gonna lie, that would actually be a pretty interesting setting, but it's speculation. We have no real idea whether or not that kind of situation actually happened, or if the priests only buried themselves in the tombs with their followers after the dragon cult lost. There are also some conflicting reports on that, so just take it all with a bit of a grain of salt. Now, another interesting tidbit of confirmed lore is that while some Nordic children's stories actually seem to have the Draugr as a sort of scare for children, some Nords don't even seem to believe in the Draugr's existence, specifically Nords who have never been close to the ancient tombs, while other, more traditionally minded Nords may even be able to trace their lineage back to a family member or family members buried in the tomb and then refuse to fight the Draugr out of fear of dishonoring an ancient family member. We actually see that happen in the lore book Kain's Challenge. Pretty interesting. And a final bit of lore is that there seem to be multiple ways to make a Draugr, or at least multiple cults and multiple beings seem to have known how the Draugr's creation worked, because we know that not all Draugr that we see in the game, especially those on Solstheim and some in tombs that aren't really connected to the dragon cult, they still contain Draugr. And some of them, for example, were made out of punishment in lore, although that may be an unreliable narrator, so might be the case that those were actually dragon cult tombs and then just other legends developed around them. But just keep in mind that this kind of necromancy seems to have been a little more common back in the days of the dragon cult and a little bit after. Now, that's about all I can say about the Draugr. Now, next up, let's talk about what's probably the cutest creature on this list, the Vvardvark, and its creator, the mage Varkanel. So, Telvanni mages. They're weird, and they're an eccentric bunch. Some of them are among the wisest and cleverest people in all of Tamriel, and others, while really smart, are outright insane. Now, the mage that we're talking about today, the mage Varkanel, was a Telvanni magister somewhere in the Second Era. His field of expertise was the field of alteration, specifically it seems to have been genetic alteration and mutation magic, and during his lifetime he worked on an experiment with the aim of creating a new animal species, a small domestic predator, a little bit like a house cat, presumably to get rid of little creatures around the house, just like a cat would. Now, that was his short-term plan with the creature. In the long term, he wanted to use this creature seemingly as some sort of genetic baseline platform to create more diverse creatures, with the creation of some sort of war beast as at least one of his end goals. It seems that he experimented with multiple creatures, trying to fuse them together into the ultimate domestic predator. likely using anteaters, aardvarks and armadillos for his base. Although we don't know the exact machinations of this experiment, nor the exact origin species that he used, we do know that one of the eventual results was the modern day Vvardvark, a result which the mage Varkanel considered a failure and a point to completely start anew at and just wipe the slate clean and start a new document in Microsoft Office terms. Because he himself was, and I quote, disgusted by the creature's unnatural form, protruding head and fusion of scales and fur, and most of all he was revolted by how cute it was, and likely also by the smell, as Vvardvarks are described to smell pretty bad. Now, it was his intention to then destroy the creature, throw it on the discard pile and start anew with his experiments. However, just before he could destroy it, his little daughter burst into his genetics lab and saw the creature. His daughter was then immediately endeared by this little creature, and when she hugged it and it licked her arm, she demanded to have the creature as a pet. Her father was quite dismayed by this, as he found the creature to be revolting and wanted to destroy it, but his daughter was relentless and in the end he couldn't say no. She was allowed to keep the creature and named it Master Scalytail. And not long after that, she then said that Master Scalytail was lonely, and thus she demanded for him to have a family. Varkanel said no, decisively, but to his daughter he seemingly couldn't say no again. So eventually Master Scalytail got a little family, and then this little family started breeding, and then this little family expanded. And some of this now not so little family escaped into the wilds on Vvardenfell. And when they escaped and were spotted by other Dunmer in the wild, they too thought that they were cute and took them in as pets, and it snowballed further and further from there. They made quite loyal pets, and they were able to eat and exterminate many bugs around the house, as they eat bugs, and they are quite affectionate towards their owners. At first, no one knew where these creatures came from, but eventually it became clear that they originated with Varkanel, who at this point must have been extremely embarrassed, considering that his own views on the creature was that it was a disappointment. But there was no reason to be embarrassed, as the people of Morrowind love these creatures, and the creature fitted well into Vvardenfell's ecosystem and later mainland Morrowind's ecosystem. So Varkanel was even approached by the Telvanni Archmagister at the time to start a full-on breeding program, out of which came several different variants, all as cute as the next. Now, over time many different variants came into being, and some not even being created by Varkanel himself, as some mages tried to create a feathered version for example, and eventually a large variant to serve as a pack animal. And the creature kind of became a national hype of sorts. The creature that Varkanel thought of as an embarrassment led to a level of success in his life that he probably couldn't have dreamed of in his wildest dreams, as he was commissioned to make even more creatures, with his genetic magical research being funded by some with the aim of making a dragon, returning them to Tamriel. Now, Varkanel did several experiments which had to lead towards reintroducing the dragon to Tamriel. Although this didn't lead to much success, as the best that he could do apparently was a radish camel lizard at first, and then later, when he was provided with some real dragon parts to fuse into his research, he was able to create these scaled creatures like scaled bears and big cats with dragon-like features, as he was never able to create a true dragon. And even if he would have gotten closer, so made a creature that might have looked like a dragon a little bit, they wouldn't have been true dragons obviously. Although apparently he did try to scam the people who commissioned him to make a dragon to just give him all the payment for the camel lizard, as he said that it looked close enough to a real dragon. Even though, let's be honest, this doesn't look like a dragon. But this failed experiment to bring back the dragon didn't really hamper his overall success in life, as the Vvardvark was a huge success in Morrowind. Now, by the late 2nd, early 3rd era, they populated almost all of Morrowind. However, unfortunately, these creatures were nearly all wiped out on Vvardenfell, at least by the Ash Blight in the 3rd era, which actually wiped out much of Vvardenfell's native ecosystem apparently. But there's no real reason to think that they might not still be alive on mainland Morrowind, and if we ever return to mainland Morrowind in a more recent timeline, there's no reason to think that we couldn't see them. Now, what exactly happened to the mage Varkanel after this whole adventure with genetic experiments, we just really don't know, but I do find this story to be quite interesting and really entertaining to boot, as his biggest embarrassment in life led to his biggest success in life. And I also really personally enjoyed the fact that he tried to scam people in thinking that this is a dragon. Yeah, I don't know, I just found that to be really funny and I laughed while researching it. And that's about all I can say about the Vvardvark and its creator, the mage Varkanel. Next up, let's talk about a fan favorite summoning creature, the Flame Atronach. So, the Flame Atronach, an elemental creature vaguely in the shape of a woman made of fire and molten rock. They are some of the most popular creatures to summon, being quite easy to summon with quite well-known incantations and being very powerful to boot. Now, when summoned, they can be highly territorial and they are, as such, excellent guardian summons. They are known to have very little in the forms of emotion with blank expressions, although other Daedric creatures actually describe them as irritable, which is pretty funny. It's said that summoning these creatures requires the incantation known as Coron's Peremptory Summons, an ancient spell which allows the user to summon Flame Atronachs. Now, while in-game we simply learn the skill book and then know the spell to summon a Flame Atronach, in the lore this would mean that we gain understanding of this incantation. And you see, Coron's Peremptory Summons is actually known as one of the more variable spells in the Elder Scrolls universe, as the incantation is apparently easily modified to change the duration of the summoning and to change the shape of the Flame Atronach that is summoned. Because we know that in the lore, Flame Atronachs exist not just in their default vaguely humanoid female form, rather they can be shaped into many different forms, with some forms even being used as mounts by extremely skilled conjurers, who then even stall them in a pocket realm of oblivion rather than a stable, which is pretty interesting. Now, some of the people who were able to first master the shaping of the Flame Atronach and mutate them through modifying their summoning were the conjuration masters of the Rennie clan, the high elves who settled in High Rock, who right now live only on this little island, which is the Isle of Balfiera. They were apparently the first to modify Flame Atronachs, and even now in modern times, summoning and modifying an Atronach into an exotic shape is known to be a sort of magical test of proficiency for the Rennie sorcerers, which is pretty interesting. Now, these exotic forms of the Flame Atronach do not seem to exist by default, as these mount forms and other mutations of the Flame Atronach are seemingly always the result of conjurers modifying their summoning incantation. You see, Flame Atronachs are Daedra, and as we talked about in my video on why the Daedra fear their so-called true names, each Daedra has a so-called true name, or nimix. A sort of formula which perfectly describes their being. The more complex the Daedra is, the bigger the mimic, or this formula which describes them. And this mimic is used to create them and to bring them back to life in the waters of oblivion in order to regenerate after being vanquished, because when Daedra are slain, they will eventually regenerate in oblivion. These mimics, it sounds kind of stupid, but they're kind of like a seed which you put into a generator, so a programming generator, for example your Minecraft world generator, although more games and programs use this principle. If you put a certain seed in, the game will always get the same world and same set of circumstances from this generator. And if you change the seed, you get a very different outcome, so in Minecraft terms you would get a different world. This is very basically how Daedra are created, because with that formula the exact same Daedra can be regenerated in Oblivion. But more information in my video on Nimix, which is in the description. Anyway, what's important for this video is that when the Flame Atronach is summoned through Coron's Peremptory Summons incantation, the conjurer can seemingly modify the Nimix of the summoned Flame Atronach pretty easily, which is why the shape and properties of Flame Atronachs are sometimes changed upon summoning, especially when experienced conjurers conjure one. And when talking about really powerful conjurers, so near divine level, they are actually known to be able to change their being to such a degree that they can give the Flame Atronach thoughts and intelligence, as in their default state they are beings with definitely some intelligence but very low intelligence. Although it is pretty rare to be able to modify a Flame Atronach to that degree, usually it's just their shape. Although, like I said, in their default form, so if they are summoned without any changes, they will generally resemble a humanoid female. In fact, in the lore, people on Tamriel who don't know about the existence of Flame Atronachs will often mistake them at their first sighting for a female elf set on fire. And only on closer examination, when they see that this elf consists out of just fire and has horns instead of eyes and spikes of molten rock on their bodies, then they discover it's not a mortal but a fire elemental Daedra. Now, the simple fact that they look like humanoids, especially humanoid females, has led to some conjurers being attracted to them, and even keeping them around because they are nice to look at. And in some powerful conjurers, there is rumors that they have Flame Atronachs in their lineage, because It's then rumored that one of their ancestors mated with one of these creatures.
Degenerates.
Yeah, exactly, Todd, but the more you know. Anyway, that probably is just an unreliable rumor though, as they are fully made of flames and literally don't have reproductive parts, but I still thought it was pretty funny that we have that in the lore. Anyway, while some people assume that the spell used to summon them actually creates the Flame Atronach, that isn't true. In reality, Flame Atronachs are summoned from a place called the Infernus, a pocket realm of oblivion inhabited entirely by Flame Atronachs. This realm is said to be one big and really boring world filled with lava, magma and fire, with the only thing other than lava and magma on the surface being crevices in the magma, spewing even more magma and lava into the already endless sea of molten rock that is the Infernus. It's said that this realm is very well known by conjurers, as it's one of the easiest to summon from, while at the same time it's almost never visited by anyone, and anyone who did visit the realm usually left really quickly, as apparently the temperature is so high that even other Daedric creatures cannot easily survive there, much less mortals, as we have no records of any mortals ever being able to enter it, with the only known other visitors being other Daedra, who were forced to leave pretty quickly apparently due to the temperature. Now, the interesting thing is that this realm, the Infernus, is actually super fascinating. Despite the landscape being boring, according to an in-universe expert on Daedric realms, it's one of the rarer types of realms. You see, while next to the big realms of the Daedric princes, there are more than 37,000 pocket realms in Oblivion that are known to exist, most of these are either realms created by one powerful creature who manifested their own realm from the chaos of Oblivion, or abandoned or ripped away parts of the Daedric Prince realms and then inhabited by other creatures after it was abandoned by or ripped away from the Daedric Prince in question, who originally created it. Now, the Infernus is neither of these types of realms, as the Infernus is known to be a collective realm, a realm created by the collective power and thoughts of its inhabitants, the Flame Atronachs. This type of realm is said to be very rare, and because each Flame Atronach is said to be quite similar, this results in the realm being quite uniform and mundane, consisting only of their basic elements, so fire, lava and magma and molten rocks in other forms. And in this simplicity, despite them being chaotic creatures, it seems that it's quite an organized realm, although organized to what degree, we don't know. We, for example, don't know about any social hierarchy. We know that creatures called Flame Atronach monarchs exist, but whether these are actual leaders in their realm or if it's just a name that mortals gave to stronger Flame Atronachs, we don't know. The only guy who was ever in there long enough to observe the Flame Atronachs in their natural state said that they looked too much alike and behaved in such a way that he wasn't able to discern whether or not they have some sort of hierarchy or if they just behave mindlessly in there. That being said, among the thousands of other Oblivion pocket realms, there's a completely opposite realm known as Takobar, or the fourth sinus of Takobar as some Daedric experts call it, which is a realm of endless cold, which has cold Flame Atronachs in it, so Flame Atronachs with blue flame that aren't hot, but instead are said to be super cold, and this is actually where the blue Flame Atronachs from Molech Baal's realm come from, as some of his servants imported them into his realm for him, which is pretty cool. And that is about all I can say about Flame Atronachs. Next up, let's talk about one of my personal favorite creatures that has featured in one of the previous creatures compilations before, the Ithguleor, the massive sea leviathan of the seas around Tamriel. I talked about it once before, yet recently I dug up more information, courtesy to the UESP doing some data mining, so, you know, here's its story, but more complete. So, the Ithguleor, a massive smelly sea leviathan prowling the seas of northern and western Tamriel. Now, observant viewers will notice that I talked about the Ithguleor once before in my video on Tamriel sea monsters, but since then the UESP, or Unofficial Elder Scrolls pages, the unofficial gold standard of community websites, has unearthed some unused and cut content related to the creature, which adds to its story quite a bit. So, since the Ithguleor is one of my favorite creatures from all of the lore, and considering there's now some new information on it, I figured the Ithguleor wanted its own video now, instead of being grouped with the sea monsters. So, let's start at the beginning. Speculation and rumor in the Elder Scrolls community about a gigantic and terrifying creature that prowls the seas of northern Tamriel in the lore has been a thing ever since the Elder Scrolls Redguard days, before even the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind came out. You see, with the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, Bethesda released this map of western Tamriel. Off the northwestern coast of High Rock is a drawing of this creature, a massive whale-like creature with 2 blowholes, large teeth and gigantic eyes. Now, this drawing wasn't elaborated on for years and remained a bit of a forgotten mystery of the Elder Scrolls community. That is, until 2014, when the Elder Scrolls Online gave us legends of a mysterious and massive sea monster prowling the Etheric Ocean near High Rock, lining up nicely with our mysterious sea monster of the past on this drawing on the map. Now, it's not a guarantee that it was this specific monster that was referenced later, but in separate instances since the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, we've had legends about a massive and terrifying creature prowling these seas in different sources. So, while not a guarantee that the information in these separate sources points to one and the same creature, I think it's too much of a coincidence of these reports all taking place in the same general area and talking about a massive sea monster for them not to relate to the same creature. So for this video I'll at least treat the separate sources as telling of one creature, the Ithguleor. Now, in the sources that we have, the Ithguleor is described as a legendary immortal leviathan that haunts the Etheric Ocean, the sea between Tamriel and Yokuda, and specifically it seems that it's basically always in this section close to High Rock, where the Ithguleor has made its way into local legend, even being used on pottery as decorations. It's said that it's so big that it's bigger than some small islands, with eyes bigger than the average house, with a massive oil-covered back. Legends of this creature primarily come from sailors, some of whom swear to have seen the creature, although some who see it never return, because according to the legends, the Ithguleor can, and will, swallow ships whole, eating its wood and its sailor like a nice evening snack. It's said to primarily live in the deep waters of the ocean of High Rock's coast, where some sailors swear to see it as a massive dark shadow beneath their ships as they sail the oceans. Probably at that point praying that it isn't hungry as they see it, because otherwise their whole ship will be eaten. Now, some of the legends and reports that we have about this creature say that as it surfaces or comes to shallower waters, the sky will darken even when there aren't any clouds or the sun isn't setting. It's said to be so big that when it prowls the shallower waters around High Rock, it changes the sandbanks and coastlines of High Rock, with the changing sand being an indication of the Ithguleor being close. And according to local legend, one can see the Ithguleor digging traps for ships in shallow seas beneath the sands of the coasts, on nights when both moons are full and there's a lot of light. Although we aren't really sure whether or not the Ithguleor actually digs traps and tries to make sandbank traps for ships, or if its movements are just so powerful that it unintentionally changes the sandbanks, which then makes the ships run aground. Although the legends do say that it specifically eats ships that have run aground, so perhaps it really is the case that it occasionally lays traps for its food by just making unexpected sandbanks just, beneath the sea surface. Now, just like in the ancient image from the Elder Scrolls Redguard, where this creature has blowholes, in the later lore, the creature also spouts water up like a whale. And not just that, it's said that when the Ithguleor spouts up water, a terrifying mist is created, which covers the entire surrounding area. And apparently that mist also carries the Ithguleor's terrifying stench. Now, in the lore, this stench is described as so bad that it seems carried straight out of Oblivion itself. Now, that specific line about Oblivion, together with the fact that the creature is described as being immortal, has led to some people speculating that the Ithguleor may actually be a massive Daedric creature that either entered the mortal plane somewhere in the distant past when the world was still being formed, making it some prehistoric demon, or perhaps it slipped into the world at some point in the Meretic or First Era, just before the Divine Covenant with Alessia, when the barriers were a bit weaker between the realms. And if this is true, then perhaps during the Oblivion Crisis in the Third Era, even more of these creatures might have slipped into the mortal plane, which may both be terrifying and really cool if the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place in Hammerfell and allows sailing like the rumors suggest it might. And then we might encounter some of these creatures as massive bosses inside the sea, which sounds really cool, but probably is a little bit too good to be true. Anyway, in the Elder Scrolls Online there's one cut quest which would have us visit this small fishing village where many locals have lost loved ones to the beast. While not much remains of this quest and no dialogue can be found, the UESP did find quest objectives which do remain, and we can see how in this quest we would have talked to some of the people who lost loved ones to the beast and then had us hunting down the beast, culminating in a boss fight against the Ithguleor with us cutting off its head and presenting it to the people of the village. In this quest, the Ithguleor would have had some sort of magical power, as we needed to get a strange whalebone talisman to protect ourselves against it. and only after obtaining said talisman would we have been able to defeat it and fight against it. Now, if I had to guess, the quest probably got cut as a result of the creature being far too big in the legends, at least one to implement into the game, and making a model for it in-game would have either been too underwhelming if they made it smaller, or really taxing on the hardware and, you know, just edging on impossible to implement if they kept it to lore-accurate size. It would probably also have been harder to cut off its head if it's so big when its eyes are as big as a house, so probably better that it got cut, because otherwise it would have been really underwhelming if they made the creature really small. Meanwhile, right now we still have the, you know, legends of a massive Coelophyton, which to me just seems really cool. Now, in the modern game, all that's left of this quest is this guy, Jean Prol, who was supposed to be someone who lost his wife at sea to the creature, and in the final game he still laments the loss of his wife, but any mention of the Ithguleor in her death has been scrubbed from the game and taken out. And that is about all I can say about the Ithguleor. Now next up, let's talk about some extinct and prehistoric creatures of Tamriel. And trust me, some of these are really interesting. So, extinct creatures. There are quite a few of them in Tamriel's lore, and we will start with one of the most interesting of the bunch, the Verminous, a creature very much like a dinosaur, which was said to roam the province of Morrowind in ancient times. The creatures seem vaguely familiar to our world's Velociraptor dinosaur, or the Troodondid or Dromaeosaur dinosaurs, as Mr. Tarpenpat, who helped me a lot with this video, suggested. Except that these creatures have several spikes and horns and long claws for hands, although it may also be similar to another dinosaur which neither I or Mr. Tarpenpat are aware of, as I am at least unfortunately not a specialist on the topic of dinosaurs. Sorry. Anyway, the Tamrielic creature, the Verminous, seems to have roamed around Morrowind since prehistoric times and died out and has gone extinct somewhere in the early First Era, as Sothasil of the Tribunal, one of Morrowind's living gods, still remembers them from that time. It is in fact through his works in the Clockwork City, Sothasil's own mechanical city, that we are even aware of the Verminous nowadays, as Sothasil has recreated a mechanical version of the Verminous, a fabricant, to populate the wilds around his artificial city, just like Morrowind had once been. In his words, he did this to try and preserve the past as a reminder of how things once were, although we don't know much about how much he changed on these creatures that he recreated. But since Sothasil's stated aim was to recreate the past and accurately preserve it, I think the Verminous would have been similar to the fabricated Verminous, but just without the mechanical parts. That having been said, we possibly have another example of Sothasil recreating an extinct species, although for this one we don't really have any concrete lore other than seeing what they look like in-game and in official art. You see, we also have this creature, the so-called hulking fabricant, which also looks vaguely like a dinosaur-like creature, and it was also created by Sothasil. So if we do some mental gymnastics, knowing that Sothasil tried to preserve the distant past, and that's why he brought the Verminous back, it's not unlikely that this may also have been an actual organic creature at some time, probably called the hulking. So that makes two Tamrielic dinosaurs, which roamed Morrowind in ancient times, which is pretty cool. And there may be even more, but we're not completely sure about that. But we do have several other examples of now extinct prehistoric Tamrielic creatures. For example, Ammonites, small mollusks with a spiral-shaped shell, at least in the real world. We know that in the oceans around Tamriel, specifically the Eltharic Ocean west of Tamriel, there once lived Ammonites in a period which is described to have been earlier than the building of the very first Meretic era ruins that we find on Tamriel, meaning that perhaps they may even date back to the Dawn era, the era of creation. Which makes these creatures super duper interesting, because adding to this is that the Ammonite shell's fossils found in specifically the Eltharic Ocean contain a lot of raw magicka, which makes the fossils glow bluish. Sometimes they contain almost as much energy or magicka as a lesser soul gem, although there's no way to load magicka into them after they've been depleted, and they lose their magical charge quite quickly after being harvested from the oceans and mines on the islands in the oceans. Some people on Tamriel speculate that this magicka infusion of these fossils is because the fossils are affected by slowed magic from Thras, But it's also possible, especially since the lore book mentions raw magicka, that these fossils are a leftover from creatures that existed when the world was being created, so they were exposed to the raw magicka of a mortal plane under construction, a bit like radiation, which is now why their fossils, so these Ammonite fossils, are imbued with raw magicka. But that's just my personal speculation, which I would think is cool. The slowed magicka option is also very much still an option. That being said, in this fossil collection from the Elder Scrolls Battlespire that you've seen on screen so far, we can see not only just Ammonites, but we can also see Trilobites, which were ancient arthropods living in the seas in our own universe in prehistoric times. But unfortunately, other than this image, we have nothing else on Trilobites on Tamriel in the Elder Scrolls universe, so sorry, but hey, they're in an official image, so they may have existed. That having been said, another creature that we don't have much on is the so-called lava troll, a troll once said to have been native to Morrowind, specifically to Vvardenfell. Although some even doubt whether or not lava trolls were ever even real or not. That will be a trend in this video, as you'll see. Because this is so far all that we know of it, and people on Tamriel actually doubt whether they existed at some point. Like, we don't even know why it was called the lava troll, perhaps because it was able to live close to lava? I don't know. We just don't know. Now, an extinct creature that we know a bit more of is the so-called Wraxu, a bird which had lived in Blackmarsh since before the Elves came to Tamriel, where it had some connection to Sithis worship in the society of the ancient Argonians, specifically with worship connected to reincarnation and life cycles, it seems. They were apparently really big, as tall as a mammoth, with huge tongues, and they were distantly related to the terror birds of elsewhere. They were actually only driven extinct near the tail end of the First Era in the year 2828, a year when several other species in Blackmarsh also went extinct. Because you see, during this year the Reman Empire attempted to conquer Blackmarsh and accidentally set fire to much of the province when they set fire to a bog near Stormhold. But they didn't realize that much of the bogs are connected both over and underground, making it so that large swaths of Blackmarsh straight up burned down in an event called the Great Burn. During this event, much of Blackmarsh's creatures either had a big dip in their population or were outright driven extinct, with the Wraxu being one of the creatures driven to extinction by the event. But this loss of biodiversity was not limited to just the Wraxu, as we both lost the so-called long-legged swamp wolves and the Hellstrom crocodiles, and presumably even more creatures than just those, except those didn't make it into the lore. Now, neither of these we know particularly much of, other than that, just like the Wraxu, they were presumably big creatures, as at least the Hellstrom crocodile is said to have been a really large type of crocodile, and the long-legged swamp wolves, well, they have long legs, so they may be big, but, well, we don't really know much else about them, other than that they entered into a steep population decline during and after the Great Burn, with the last sighting of one of these taking place in the very early Second Era. Now, there are some other creatures where we know that they are extinct, but other than that, we don't know much more of them. Examples of these include flightless desert hawks, which I presume would have been much like ostriches, but then hawks. Roaming the desert. We also have prehistoric snow owls, which may have been a variation of regular snow owls, and we also have the so-called musk ox, a type of ox which once apparently lived in western Skyrim, specifically in the Reach, where its horns were presumably used by Reachmen as war horns, which is also literally the only thing we know about them, as a war horn is the only thing that we have of them, but even the description of that warhorn speculates that it may have been a Minotaur, so we don't even know whether these oxes existed, but hey, it's worth a mention. Now, a creature that we know similarly little about is the so-called Naturbal, a rock-skinned bug which in ancient times was native to Vvardenfell and Red Mountain, which were all driven extinct by the Dunmer, with the last one reportedly being slain by Vvardvark himself using his legendary spear, with a statue in Vvardvark City actually commemorating the event. We also don't know much more about the Naturbal, sorry, as I already mentioned in my video on all the bugs of Tamriel. Check that video out, by the way. It's a pretty good video. It's in the description. Alright, but let's return to a creature that we know a bit more of, the so-called Garnet Bird, a tropical bird that was once native to the Topal Bay to the south of Cyrodiil, and apparently they had a beak with the color of a red garnet, and back in the late First Era, they became a favorite of noble dining tables, often served at great feasts after being drowned in wine. This became such a popular dish that the garnet beaks were driven to extinction, quite quickly actually, as they were hunted down for noble dining tables. Good job, guys. Now, We have one more bird type that's now extinct that we know of, the so-called Gooblet Bird, a large flightless bird with colorful feathers native to Hammerfell, which were driven extinct sometime after the arrival of the Yokudans on Tamriel. How they were driven extinct? We don't know. Could be anything. Could be the Yokudans, could not have been. I don't know. That having been said, we also know of the gigantic prehistoric emperor crabs. Gigantic crabs that once roamed the ashlands of Vvardenfell. These large gigantic crabs were sometimes as big as a cathedral, and apparently they were a sight to behold. And for this one we actually know quite certain that they existed, as their ancient shells are still being used. For example, the gigantic shell of the emperor crab Scar was being used to house the city of Ald'ruhn, as we can see in Morrowind and the Elder Scrolls Online. However, by the Third Era, all of these Emperor Crabs had died out. They were being hunted down by both Ashlanders and by House Redoran, with some people saying that those that remained may have devolved into the Mud Crabs, but we don't know what's true about that. Now, for the final set of extinct creatures, we actually need to delve into some history. So, a little history. In the middle of the Meretic era, the Aldmer, that's the Aldmer with a D, so the progenitor race of all elven races that we find on Tamriel, not the current High Elves, fled their homeland of Aldmurish due to it being endangered by some mysterious impending doom. Now, the first place that they landed were the Somerset Isles, although it wouldn't take long before they also hopped over to Valenwood and tried to colonize it. However, these lands that they landed on, the Somerset Isles and Valenwood, they weren't exactly empty when the first elves arrived. In fact, they were inhabited by a large range of creatures, many of whom were large, dangerous and not very welcoming to these elves that landed on their shores. But the elves didn't really care about that and just decided to kill all of them to make these lands safe. A few of such creatures which they encountered, like griffins, ended up surviving up until the current day and get tamed. But not all ancient creatures that the Aldmer encountered were as lucky, as the Aldmer drove many of the creatures they encountered to extinction by just killing all of them and preventing their procreation in order to make the Somerset Isles livable for themselves, and they then tried but kinda failed to do the same in Valenwood. When it comes to the Somerset Isles, there are two main legendary and mythical creatures which were driven to extinction. Basically, we've got the Gaetus and the Iliadi. Let's start with the Iliadi, which is a type of forest spirit, or even fairy according to some theories. They were creatures with more than just two eyes, as they were forest giants whose entire heads were covered by eyes. These creatures were apparently also aggressive to the Aldmer, being named in ancient Aldmeri ballads as working with other creatures to try and achieve the Aldmer's demise and drive them from the Isles. Unfortunately for these creatures, they were no match for the early Aldmer, however, who brought ancient magic from their homeland of Aldmuris, which was used to exterminate them in just a few short years after their landing. Now, the other mythical enemy of the Aldmer that they found when landing on the Isles and who wasn't particularly friendly to them and they exterminated was the Gaetus. Now, how exactly these Gaetus lost to the ancient Aldmeri magic is not very clear to me. Because according to legend, the Gaetus were straight up godlike fairies with, according to legends, godlike powers. And because of that, I personally kinda doubt whether or not they even existed in the way that they are described, or were just adapted into Aldmeri legend in a more grand way to make their victory over these creatures seem more epic. But yeah, we don't really know. What we do know is that on ancient Aldmer tapestries, the Gaetus are described as a type of godlike fairy which takes the shape of a single man or multiple men which are created from the earth itself. This man or group of men is then surrounded by minor fairies which all do its bidding. Considering that these creatures are extinct, I wouldn't be surprised if the Gaetus was just one of the Earthmen and the rest were minor spirits. But we don't really know anything about them, unfortunately, and even that's all conjecture. Anyhow, those two, the Iliadi and the Gaetus, were driven to extinction on the Somerset Isles by the early Aldmer in their quest to make the Isles theirs. But there's actually another creature that was driven to extinction on the Somerset Isles, and that one was called the so-called Isgareth bee. This type of bee used to be quite common on the Somerset Isles since ancient times, but due to the belief of some Aldmer that their honey granted immortality, which was really just legend and seemingly not true, it seems that their hives were all destroyed by greedy Aldmer somewhere in the First Era. All of them then went extinct. Although some conspiracy theorists on Tamriel believe that some royalty still have them in private gardens, but we don't have any proof on that. Now, just like on the Somerset Isles, the Aldmer immediately started blasting when they arrived to Valenwood, while the jungles proved to be harder to exterminate species in than the Isles. as many of their ancient predators still live in the jungles nowadays, they did manage to get rid of a few creatures. Most notably the basilisk, a creature that we see in many types of fantasy, but which also exists in the Elder Scrolls lore, but it's just extinct due to the doing of the elves. Now, the portrayal of basilisks, from what we know, is pretty conventional, because it's a snake with magical powers and whose body parts have magical properties. And likely, just like in other types of fantasy, looking them in the eyes would have caused for paralysis, but that's just speculation, as their eyes, cooked up in a potion, can be used to cure paralysis. So I'd say that it's likely that looking them in the eye would have had the inverse effect and probably paralyzed you, especially since that's the whole thing with basilisks and other types of media. That said, their body parts, while rare, are still sometimes seen on the black market in private collections of alchemists and other craftsmen, because their eyes are a potent ingredient and their blood can temper weapons, and powdered body parts can even give you a poisonous explosion, which is all pretty useful. That said, of the creatures which they drew to extinction in Valenwood, we know relatively little other than the basilisks. For example, of the creature, the Odawak, we know literally nothing more than their name, and that they are extinct in Valenwood now, and that they apparently had really big fangs, and that Bosmer legend says that they drove them to extinction, and not the Altmer. We also know that in Valenwood there used to live hippogriffs, who were likely related to the griffins in some way, but they were also driven to extinction. How? We don't know. Hydra also existed, multi-headed dragon-like creatures likely also driven to extinction, although those may still exist in other parts of Nirn. And forest giants, likely related to the Iliadi, also existed and also were apparently driven to extinction. And satyrs were also in existence, which we don't know anything of other than that they were there and we know their names. We don't even know what type of creature they were, only the name from the Pocket Guide to the Empire, and that they were, you may guess, driven to extinction by the early Altmer who had landed in Valenwood. But considering that in other types of fantasy they are essentially fauns, a man-beast who are part goat, part man, I think that's the type of creature that they probably were before being driven to extinction. In the High Isle DLC of the Elder Scrolls Online, we actually see some fauns, so perhaps there's a chance that those were the creatures that they meant by the name satyr, so they may not be extinct, but we don't know if that's actually the case. Now, a final honorable mention for this video goes to Skyrim's snow whales, a creature which is possibly purely mythical, but may also have been real. We just don't really know. You see, snow whales were legendary flying whales which flew through the skies of Skyrim, just like sand whales apparently flew over the deserts of Hammerfell, living at the tops of the highest mountains and shooting through the clouds, with Nord hunters hunting them fiercely. And the Whalebone Bridge in Sovngarde was said to have been constructed from the bones of a snow whale. But these creatures were supposedly only visible after drinking a strange potion, and some of the other out-of-game legends about them describe them as even more fantastical, so it could also just be some hallucination of the Nords which hadn't made its way into Nordic legend. We don't really know. Whatever the truth is, they haven't been seen on Tamriel for a very long time. And that is about all I can say for Volume 3 of the lore collection on Tamriel's interesting creatures and monsters. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this, and a Volume 4 in about a year, when I've covered even more creatures, is basically inevitable at this point. But still, I'm really still enjoying them. Like, learning about creatures is one of my favorite things, so they're one of the types of videos that I do the most. Now, that having been said, thank you so much if you watched the entire thing. If you did, it's more or less a tradition at this point, but let's confuse everyone else in the comments by just, seemingly unpromptedly telling me what your favorite book is. I need something new to read, and, dedicated viewers are probably some of the better people to ask this, since we probably have the same taste, otherwise why would you listen to my videos for so long? So tell me your favorite book in the comments if you watched the entire thing. Alright, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.